Welcome to another unit in this course on economics, where we're going to talk today on how we can derive the LMCurve which describes all the equilibria on the money market. So if we start with this, we first can, discuss a little bit what the LMCurve is all about. As I said, it's more or less all equilibria on the money market. So if we talk about an equilibrium, we need first to talk about the demand side and the supply side. So if we start with the demand for money, that's basically due to the reason of us wanting to stay liquid. So it's a question of liquidity. That's actually where the L in LMCurve comes from, liquidity. There are three reasons for this, or three motives for money demand. That's the transaction motive. People need money to actually realize transactions. They need this as a means of exchange. And the money motive is related to income. If you have higher income, you're going to have more transactions, you're going to spend more money, therefore you also need more money. So it's positively related to income here as in the GDP. That's this part. Then the second motive, it's the speculation motive. We want to store money in one form or another. So it's basically the idea consumption versus savings. And this depends on the interest rate. Depends on whether you want to save more or less money. And finally, we have the so-called security motive. Here, we're more or less taking a look ahead. We need money to store this money so that we can be prepared for unforeseen future events. That's like some kind of insurance motive. So the first part is on consumption, the second part is on savings, and the third part is on insurance. And if we have these three types of motives for money demand, the only thing left is to talk about money supply. There's only one institution that supplies money, and that's the central bank. So money supply comes from the central bank, and it's basically M by P, which is the real money supply. Okay, we have the three reasons, the three demand reasons. We have the supply, so we basically build one equation equaling the two parts. This gives us the equilibrium on the money market in the following form. Money supply being equal to money demand, as with the transaction, speculation, and more or less insurance or safety motive. I put the safety motive here into parentheses because oftentimes this is excluded. Because we assume in most cases people only make the decision to either spend their money, consumption, or save their money. That's this part. So that's the main part we're going to focus here. However, for completion's sake, this would be here as well. As I said, money demand, liquidity, money supply, it's more or less money. That gives us L and M. That's because it's called LMCurve, because liquidity is equal to money supply. And then, once we stated this equilibrium condition, what we're going to do is simply take this equation and solve this for R. However, if we have functions like this, we would have to take the function which makes this ms of R go away. So we actually need the inverse function of ms. That's actually a bit of a problem, especially if we don't know anything specific about this type of functional relationship. So what we're going to do here, for this slide at least, and to illustrate the basic idea, is we take a very simplified approach to the money demand side, to the transaction and the speculation motive. So here our transaction motive is simply a parameter h times the income, and with the speculation motive, whereas we assume that this is negatively dependent on the interest rate, we simply model this as minus a second parameter h mark times the interest rate r. Then we have a very simplified version of this equilibrium condition, a very simplified version which we can easily solve for the parameter of interest r. When we're solving this for r, because in this context, similarly to the IS curve, we have two endogenous variables, GDP, y, interest rate, r. So we have to express one of them via the other. So here we are always solving for r and trying to express r as a function of y. Well, if we solve this for the interest rate r, we get this solution, r as a function of y. What we see here, this part, that's our absolute term. And the part here in front, the h divided by h mark, that's our slope of this relation. And in particular, we can note that the slope is positive. H and h mark are considered both positive parameters. So here the quotient of the two parameters is positive as well. So in other words, there is a positive relation between GDP and the interest rate. Meaning our LM curve, this part here, is a positively increasing function. This is or can be shown mathematically, can be shown with the simplified version, can also be shown and argued if we make this a bit more complex. However, let's leave it as this. And then we can actually do the same thing, but from a graphical point of view, to illustrate this in a slightly different way. And here we're going to start with our transaction motive in the lower right. So we have here transaction motive depending on income, on GDP. We said it's a positive relation. So it looks like this. And we're going to put into the opposing quadrant the speculation motive. Here we said it's a negative relation between interest rate and how much money is demanded. Well, here we actually have used a slightly different version of modeling the speculation motive, because if you think back to the slide before, there we had a linear version or linearized version, was simply minus h mark times r. If we have a linear version, we also get a linear LM curve. However, you can also model this negative relationship with this hyperbolic functional relationship. This would look like, for example, h mark divided by r. Here, let's have a look how this would turn out if we actually use such an hyperbolic relation instead of a linear relation. Well, that's our speculation motive. That's the transaction motive. And we can directly see, and that's also why I wrote it down like this, that speculation motive and transaction motive are actually linked because the money supply is fixed. The central bank is only offering a specific fixed amount of money. So they are actually interacting with each other. If the money demand for transaction increase, the money demand for speculation has to go down because we don't have enough money. So those two are actually linked. They are linked in a negative fashion, as I explained. If one of them increases, the other one has to decrease. So this is more or less the equilibrium condition we have here. And then we can simply start by selecting either a GDP or an interest rate. And for example, as in this context, start here, this GDP value, giving us this amount of money demanded in the context of the transaction motive. So considering our money supply, we have this much money available for speculation purposes. This would relate to an interest rate of this size. So we get this particular point up here. Then we're going to do the same thing again. Different GDP, different amount of money demanded for transactions, leading to a different amount of money used for speculation purposes, resulting in a different interest rate, giving us a second point. Now we could continue this indefinitely for a lot of different other points. If we were going to do this, what we would end up with is a function like this. This is actually also slightly curved because the speculation motive was hyperbolic, was also slightly curved. If the speculation motive, if here we would have used a linear version, we would also have gotten a linear curve here in the upper right. And well, whatever we get in the upper right, that's then our LM curve. That's the same as the result we get from our mathematical modeling from the slide before. And as we can see here, it's describing a positive relation between income and interest, between GDP and interest rate. However, there's one addition to be made to the LM curve, because this is just the normal ideal form of the LM curve. We have two additional areas or sections of the LM curve. The first one is the so-called classical section. Here we assume that the interest rate is independent of GDP. Or rather, GDP is independent of the interest rate. So even if the interest rate changes, there are no changes to GDP. So money market and goods market are separate. Or rather, capital market and goods market are separate. And we have the part down here, the so-called Keynesian section. That's the exact opposite. That's also an area which in some cases is referred to as liquidity trap. So at this point we assume the interest rate cannot decrease any more. So it's at its lowest point. So for a long time, economists assumed that this would always occur at, for example, 0% interest, because the assumption was interest rate cannot go lower than 0%. Well, nowadays we see that's not really true, but still we assume there's like this theoretical lower bound. Well, in this case, changes in GDP, higher, lower income, higher, lower demand, would actually not have any impact on the interest rate at all. Well, that's then all the different versions or sections of the LM curve combined into a single version of the LM curve. And depending on which section we are considering or where our overall domestic equilibrium lies, we get different effects regarding economic policy. Well, that's then basically everything there is to LM curves, to the derivation of the LM curve. So that concludes the session, and I say goodbye and see you next time.